in 1882 somewhere in the American South. A black family, formal and dignified, dressed in their best clothes, poses inside a photography studio. At first look, it seems like hundreds of other portraits from that time, a moment frozen in history, a family proud enough to pay for the chance to be remembered. But look closer. One member of this family, a young girl standing at the edge of the frame, has something in her eyes that no one noticed for more than 140 years. Something that, when a genetic historian finally examined this photograph using digital magnification, made him fall completely silent. Because what he found was not just a physical feature. It was a key, a biological key written into her DNA. One that had survived slavery, survived erasure, survived generations of silence, and was about to reveal the true origin of an entire family whose past had been deliberately wiped away. This is the story of what was hidden in that little girl's eyes, and it will change how you think about identity, ancestry, and what DNA remembers, even when history forgets. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, if you believe forgotten histories deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It takes only 2 seconds and it means everything. Now, let's return to 1882. Dr. James Okafor had spent 15 years rebuilding lost family histories. His office at Howard University in Washington, D.C. was filled with framed photographs, not of his own relatives, but of strangers, people whose names had been erased, whose stories had been swallowed by time. Each framed image on his wall represented a case he had solved, a life brought back. The morning Diane walked in, it was raining. She was in her early 50s, wearing a gray coat, and she carried a flat cardboard envelope the way people carry something precious, close to her chest, both arms wrapped around it as if shielding it from the weather outside. "My grandmother left it to me," she said, placing it carefully on his desk, and her grandmother passed it down to her. No one knows who these people are, not their names, not where they came from, nothing. James opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph about 8 by 10 inches, mounted on a thick cardboard backing. A cabinet card, the standard portrait style of the 1880s. It was in remarkable condition. The edges were slightly brown and a bit warped, but the image itself was sharp and clear. A family of 7 stood inside what looked like a photography studio. The backdrop behind them was painted to resemble a garden, a common style of that time. The father stood in the center, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit and tie. His expression was calm, almost serious, the way many people looked in photos from that period because long exposure times required them to stay still. Beside him, a woman, likely the mother, sat in a wooden chair, dressed in a high-collared blouse, her hands resting in her lap. Around them, 5 children were arranged with care. 2 older boys stood on the left. 2 younger girls sat on a low bench in the front, and 1 girl, the youngest, maybe 7 or 8 years old, stood slightly apart on the far right side of the frame. At the bottom of the cardboard backing, in faded ink, someone had written a date, October 14, 1882. There was no name, no location, no studio stamp on the back, only a faint rectangular mark where one had once been carefully removed. James studied the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up a magnifying glass from his desk. "Has anyone ever looked at this closely?" he asked. Diane shook her head. "Not really. We always thought it was just a simple portrait." James brought the glass to the image, and that was when something stopped him completely. He almost missed it. The magnifying glass moved across the photograph the way it always did, slowly and carefully, left to right, top to bottom, noting details, searching for clues, the style and loathing, the furniture in the studio, the quality of the photographic paper. These were the tools of James's work, the small details that helped him date and place an image accurately. He had already noticed several things. The high-collared clothing on the boys suggested the early 1880s rather than the 1870s. The painted garden backdrop matched studio practices in the American South during the Reconstruction era. The quality of the paper and the mounting card suggested a photographer with some professional skill. Not an amateur, but someone with access to proper equipment and materials. Whoever this family was, they had made a clear decision to be photographed by someone experienced. It was when the magnifying glass reached the youngest girl, the one standing apart at the far right, that James paused. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, as if she had moved just before the photo was taken. In that small turn, both of her eyes were visible, and they were not the same. And in the sepia tones of a 19th century photograph, the difference was clear. The left eye was dark, a deep, even tone consistent with brown, the expected color for a black child of that time. But the right eye was lighter, noticeably lighter. Where the left eye absorbed light, the right eye reflected it differently, with an almost pale gray appearance that stood out in the image even in black and white. James set the magnifying glass down and reached instead for the digital scanner on the shelf behind him. It took him 12 minutes to scan the photograph at high resolution and bring it onto his screen. He used the software he had relied on for years to improve archival images, increasing contrast, adjusting brightness, sharpening details digitally without changing the original file. When the enhanced image filled the screen and he zoomed in on the girl's face, he leaned back in his chair and stayed silent for a long time. The right eye was blue-gray, clearly and unmistakably blue and gray, visible in the subtle light tones the original photograph had captured without anyone ever realizing it. A black child in 1882 with one brown one and one blue-gray eye. He turned to Diane, who was watching him from across the desk. "Tell me everything you know about this family," he said. Everything. Diane knew very little. That was the truth, and she said it honestly. The photograph had been passed down through 4 generations of women, grandmother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter, always with the same simple instruction: keep this, it matters. But no one had ever been able to explain why. No names had been kept with it, no letters, no records, no clear stories. "My great-great-grandmother got it from someone she called the old woman," Diane said. "That is all I know. The old woman gave it to her before she died and told her not to lose it." James nodded slowly, still looking at the screen. He typed quickly and opened a medical reference database he had saved years ago, not a genealogist usually uses. But James had learned that genetics and history were not separate fields. They were the same story told in different ways. Waardenburg syndrome type 2A, autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. He read the entry carefully, like a detective studying a case file, searching for clear and useful details. Waardenburg syndrome is a genetic condition that affects pigmentation of the hair, skin, and eyes. The most noticeable features include heterochromia iridis, meaning eyes of different colors or one eye with 2 colors, and a white forelock, a patch of white or silver hair at the front of the head. It is caused by mutations in several genes, most commonly PAX3, MITF, or EDNRB, all of which affect the development of melanocytes, the cells responsible for pigmentation. James focused on the phrase autosomal dominant. It meant the mutation needed to come from only one parent to appear. And more importantly, it meant that in a family line where this mutation existed, it would appear again and again across generations in about half of the children. If the young girl in the 1882 photograph had Waardenburg syndrome, she had inherited it from one of her parents, and that parent had inherited it from one of theirs, forming an unbroken biological line stretching back through time. He looked again at the image on the screen. The girl's pale eyes seemed to look back at him across more than a century. "This child," he said slowly, "has a genetic condition called Waardenburg syndrome. It is inherited and dominant. It does not skip generations like some other conditions." Diane leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," James replied, "this did not start with her." James spent the rest of that afternoon working through the digital image. He examined every part of the photograph again, this time not focusing only on the girl's eyes, but on the other faces, searching for the same pattern. The 2 older boys showed nothing unusual. Their eyes looked evenly and dark. The mother's face was partly turned, her right eye hidden in shadow that the original photographer had not corrected. The father's gaze was direct, his eyes dark and even. Then James looked at the second girl, the one sitting on the bench, slightly older than the child with different colored eyes, maybe 10 or 11. He had not paid much attention to her before. She sat with her hands in her lap, facing the camera, her expression serious like many children told to stay still for a photograph. Her eyes were dark, both of them the same, but at the top of her head, just above her left temple, partly hidden by her hairstyle, there was something the enhanced image now made clear. A patch, maybe 2 inches wide, where the hair was much lighter than the rest. Not gray, not just lighter, but white, bright white, like a classic white forelock in old photographs. A small mark of missing pigment standing out against her dark hair. James stayed very still. The white forelock, a key sign of Waardenburg syndrome, appeared in one child, while the other showed heterochromia. Two different signs of the same condition in siblings, meaning the mutation had shown itself differently in each child, but came from the same source. He looked again at the father, then at the mother whose face remained partly hidden in shadow. He picked up his phone and called a colleague from the genetics department, Dr. Patricia Yuen, who had worked with him on several previous cases. "Patricia," he said when she answered, "I need you to look at something tomorrow morning, a photograph from 1882. "What should I be looking for?" she asked. "Waardenburg markers in two siblings, one with heterochromia, one with a white forelock." He paused briefly. "And I need you to tell me which parent it came from. Because one of those parents has a shadow over part of their face, and I think that shadow is hiding something." There was a short silence on the line. "I will be there at 8, she said. Patricia said it quietly, and Dr. Patricia Yuen came into James' office carrying coffee and a hard drive. She was the sort of person who prepared before asking anything, and by the time she sat across from him, she had already opened 3 medical journals about Waardenburg syndrome type 2 on her laptop. She examined the enhanced photograph on James' screen without speaking for several minutes. She zoomed in on the girl with the heterochromia, then on the older sister with the white forelock, then on the mother's partly shadowed face. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when thinking. "The shadow isn't hiding the eyes," she said at last. "It's hiding the hair." She was right. When James adjusted the contrast on the mother's image, pushing the digital enhancement further than he had the day before, he was able to see a clearer image. A detail appeared at the mother's hairline just above her left temple. The shadow that had covered half her face came from the studio lighting, but at the edge of it, just barely visible, was a thin line of lighter hair, the same position as the white forelock on the older daughter. "She's the carrier," Patricia said softly. "The mutation passed through her." James leaned back. A black woman in 1882 with Waardenburg syndrome. 2 children clearly showing the trait. A photograph with no name, no place, no studio mark. The next step was obvious. The Freedmen's Bureau records. After the Civil War, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, usually called the Freedmen's Bureau, had tried to record the lives of formerly enslaved people across the South. The records were incomplete and flawed, often shaped by the bias of the agents who wrote them, but they were the closest thing to a census for Black Americans in the years right after emancipation. James had access to the digitized Freedmen's Bureau database, a project finished only a few years earlier. After years of careful indexing by genealogists and volunteers, he searched by physical description, which the Bureau records, and sometimes included, looking for any mention of unusual eye color. The search took most of the morning. At 11:47, a record showed up on his screen, a labor contract dated 1866 from a district in South Carolina. The contracting party was listed as a woman. Her first name was given as Eliza. Next to her name, in the neat handwriting of the bureau agent, was a note in parentheses. "One eye brown, one eye gray-blue, distinctive." James' hands became still on the keyboard. Eliza. The name sat on the screen like a stone dropped into quiet water. James stared at it for a long moment before reaching for his notebook. The labor contract from the Freedmen's Bureau listed her age as about 35 years old in 1866, which meant she was likely born around 1831. It listed no surname. Formerly enslaved people were often recorded without one in official papers from that time, or with the surname of a former enslaver that they had already rejected. It listed no place of origin. It gave only her name, her rough, in South Carolina where she was working, and that single physical detail that had survived because a bureau agent, for reasons James would never know, thought it worth writing down. One eye brown, one eye gray-blue, distinctive. He had a name. He had an approximate birth year. He had a location, and he had a genetic marker that acted like a fingerprint, a biological note written into her body that no document could erase. The next archive was harder. Slave manifests. The shipping records used to track the transport of enslaved people along domestic trade routes were among the most revealing and most brutal records in American history. They listed people like cargo, name, age, height, physical description, and the name of the person claiming ownership. They were not created out of concern for humanity, but because moving enslaved people across state lines required legal paperwork. James searched the digitized collections held by the National Archives and several university libraries. He searched records from South Carolina, cross-checking with the estimated birth window he had for Eliza. He went through manifests from the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the years when Eliza would have been a child and then a young woman. On the second day, he found a manifest from 1849, a coastal shipping record from Charleston, South Carolina. Among the listed individuals was a girl, about 18 years old, first name Eliza. Next to her description, the agent who prepared the document had written 2 words that confirmed everything. Eyes different. James read those 2 words several times. Eyes different, in the harsh transactional language of a slave manifest, a human being's most unique feature. The genetic trait she carried from her ancestors had been recorded as a small curiosity, a note in a ledger. 2 words that had waited 175 years to matter. He picked up his phone and called Diane. "I found her," he said. "Her name was Eliza, and I know where she came from." Anne arrived at his office within the hour. She sat across from him with her coat still on, her hands folded on the desk, listening without interrupting as James explained everything. The Freedmen's Bureau record, the labor contract, the slave manifest from Charleston. He showed her each document on the screen, reading the key parts aloud, watching her face as the pieces slowly came together into something clear. When he finished, she stayed quiet for a moment. "Eliza," she said, as if testing how it sounded. "That was her name. That's what the records show. The physical description matches the heterochromia, the note in the labor contract, the timing. It's the same woman with a high level of certainty. She is the mother in this photograph." Diane nodded slowly. Then she asked, "Where did she come from before Charleston, before South Carolina?" That was the question James had been expecting, and it was the one he could not answer with documents alone. He had already reached out to an genealogy lab, one that focused on ancestral DNA reconstruction using old family photographs as a starting point. The technology was fairly new and still not perfect, but it had been used successfully in several major ancestry cases in recent years. By studying visible traits in archival photos, skin tone, eye color, facial features, combined with genetic databases of known Waardenburg syndrome mutations, it was possible to narrow down the geographic and ethnic origin of a mutation with real accuracy. But there was another path: Diane herself. If she was a descendant of the family in the photograph, and the way the photograph had been passed down through 4 generations of women made that very likely, then her own DNA carried the answer. "Have you ever taken a genetic ancestry test?" James asked. "No," she paused. "Should I?" "I think you should, but not one of the common ones. I want to refer you to Patricia's lab. They can run a full mitochondrial DNA sequence that traces your maternal line directly, mother to mother to mother to mother, as far back as possible." Diane agreed immediately. The test took 11 days. When Patricia called James with the early results, her voice had a tone he recognized. Careful. Controlled excitement from a scientist who has found something important but is not yet ready to say how important. "The mitochondrial haplogroup," Patricia said, "is L3, specifically a subclade that the database connects with a very narrow region." She paused. "West Africa, Sierra Leone, and nearby areas. The Waardenburg mutation in this line matches a variant that has been recorded in exactly one population group in existing research. That group was the Mende." James knew the name. Most historians of the Atlantic slave trade did. The Mende people of Sierra Leone had been among the most heavily targeted groups during the final years of the legal transatlantic slave trade, a time of intense raiding and trafficking before the British naval blockade of the West African coast. And their culture, language, and social systems had been deeply disrupted by the trade. They were also, as Patricia's database confirmed, the only known group in West Africa where this specific PAX3 gene mutation linked to Eliza's form of Waardenburg syndrome had been found in more than one individual. James spent 2 days reading everything he could about the Mend, their communities, their resistance, their presence in historical records of the slave trade. Then, while searching the digitized collection of the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans, a collection focused on African American history, he found something unexpected, a letter. It was handwritten, dated 1891, and addressed to no one in particular. The writer described herself only as a woman who had once been called by another name. The letter was written in careful, deliberate English, the kind used by someone who learned the language later in life in a country that was not their own. It had been donated to the archive in 1934 by a family in Charleston along with a small group of papers and had been cataloged but rarely read. James read it twice before he fully understood what he was seeing. The woman described her childhood in a village near a river. She described being taken at night with members of her family by men who spoke a language she did not understand. She described a ship. She described arriving somewhere cold and unfamiliar. She described being given a new name, Eliza, because the name she was born with was considered too hard to pronounce by the people who claimed to own her. And near the end of the letter, in a passage that made James put down his coffee cup and sit very still, she wrote, "My mother had eyes that did not match, one dark as river mud, one pale as morning sky. She told me her mother had the same. She told me it was a sign that we came from a certain place, and that no matter how far we were taken, that sign would follow us." James read that line 4 more times. Then he called Diane. He read the entire letter to her over the phone. When he reached the part about the eyes, she made a sound he could not fully name, not quite a word, not quite a cry. Something in between. He waited until she could speak again. "She wrote it herself," Diane said at last. "Yes, in her own hand. She remembered everything, her village, her mother, the name she was born with." He paused. "She didn't write that name in the letter. I think she was protecting it, keeping it to herself, but she described the place, the river, the land." James had spent the previous evening comparing the details in the letter with historical maps of Sierra Leone from the mid-19th century. The river she described, its width, how close it was to the coast, the kind of trees along its banks, matched the Sewer River in southern Sierra Leone. The Sewer River Valley had been a Mend heartland for centuries. Patricia's mitochondrial DNA results, the Wardenberg mutation, the letter, the geography, they all pointed to the same place, the same people, the same origin. A family photographed in a studio in South Carolina in 1882 with no recorded name and no history attached had come from the banks of the Sewer River in Sierra Leone. Their ancestor had been taken from that river valley sometime in the 1830s or 1840s during the final brutal years of the transatlantic slave trade. She had survived the crossing. She had survived enslavement. She had raised children and grandchildren on land that was not hers. And she had carried in her eyes, in her children's hair, in the DNA of every descendant that followed, an unbreakable biological record of where she came from. James thought about the young girl in the photograph, the one standing at the far right of the frame, her face turned slightly toward the camera. One eye dark and one eye pale, a 7-year-old child in 1882, who had no way of knowing that the thing that made her different was also the thing that would one day guide a historian 140 years later to the name of her great-great-grandmother's river. He thought about what it means to carry something in your body that you cannot see or feel or name, something that outlasts everything else, that outlasts ships and auctions and ledgers and silence. He sat with that thought for a long time. Then he began preparing what he would tell Diane the next morning. Diane came to James' office one last time on a Thursday morning in October, almost exactly 6 weeks after she had first arrived with the photograph held tightly against her chest in the rain. She sat across from him at the same desk. The photograph lay between them, still in its cardboard envelope, still carefully preserved through 4 generations of women. James laid everything out step by step. The Freedmen's Bureau record, the labor contract, Patricia's DNA results, the letter from the Amistad Research Center, the historical maps, the men people of the Sewer River Valley and Sierra Leone. Each piece was a step leading back through time, from a photography studio in South Carolina in 1882 to a village beside a West African river in the 1830s. Diane listened without interrupting. She looked at every document. She held the letter, a printed copy since the original was too fragile, and read the part about the mismatched eyes twice. When James finished, she stared at the photograph for a long moment. She didn't know, Diane said softly. The little girl, she didn't know what her eyes meant. No, James said. She couldn't have known. But her great-great-grandmother did. She wrote it down. Diane looked up. She wanted someone to know. She wrote it in a language that wasn't hers, in a country that wasn't hers, and she left it for someone to find. James nodded. You found it, he said. It just took 140 years. Diane picked up the photograph and looked at the girl at the edge of the frame, the girl who had shifted slightly before the shutter closed, the girl whose pale right eye had caught the studio light in a way no one had noticed or questioned for more than a century. The family had no recorded name. Their story had been deliberately and systematically erased, first by slavery, then by history's neglect, but the erasure had never been complete. It could never be complete because written into the biology of that child, into the cells of her iris, into the genes passed down from her mother and her mother before her, who had been taken from the banks of a river in Sierra Leone, was a record no document could destroy. Diane placed the photograph back on the desk. She stayed silent for a long moment. Then she said, her name was Eliza, but somewhere along that river, she had another name, and now I know where to search for it. She lifted the photograph, slid it back into its envelope, and held it against her chest with both arms, just as she had carried it into the office 6 weeks earlier in the rain. DNA does not forget. It cannot be taken, burned, or renamed. It simply waits. And sometimes, after enough time has passed, someone finally learns how to read it.